Okay, I think we can get started. Thank you very much for attending today's webinar, everybody. My name is Clionadh Introduction. I'm the founder and CEO of ACLED, which is the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Organization. Today, we'll be discussing a very important report released this morning called Bombing into Submission, Russian Targeting of Civilians in Healthcare, Education, Residential, and Energy Infrastructure in Ukraine. As I mentioned, the report was released this morning in time for the 3-year anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is on Monday. The report is quite important in that it examines documented trends of Russian targeting of civilians and infrastructure, which is greatly impacting the lives of Ukrainian civilians across the countries, not just on the front line. And what we found in ACLED is that throughout this conflict, we've collected over 140,000 conflict events recorded between February 2022 and December of last year. We continue, of course, to collect that in real time. And we've found that over 5,000, in fact, 5,500 events targeted civilian infrastructure, and these patterns reveal indiscriminate strikes on residential houses, medical facilities, educational institutions, and the energy sector. Of course, these strikes have led to increasing hardships on civilians and make Ukraine ever more dependent on external support, and of course, complicating future and ongoing efforts to recover from this conflict. It's been quite an active week for this conflict, and of course the decisions being made outside of Ukraine, outside from Ukrainians, are going to impact heavily on what happens in the future. But our panelists today should give us both an excellent overview of what's happening at the moment and what has happened in the last 3 years, but also what kind of situation it places Ukraine in going forward. So we're joined by the co-authors of the report, Nikita Gorkov and Ola Polichuk. Nikita is ACLED's senior analyst for Europe and Central Asia. He conducts and coordinates analysis for the entire region. He holds an MA in International Politics from the University of Manchester and a BA in Journalism from Moldova State University. He's previously worked on conflicts in both Moldova and Ukraine. Ola is ACLED's Eastern European Research Manager. She oversees data collection and analysis for that region. Ola holds an LLM in Law of the Sea, which I didn't know until recently and I'm fascinated about, from the Arctic University in Norway, and the same degree in Human Rights Law and International Law from the University of Kent, and a bachelor's degree in International Law from the Taras Shevchenko National University of Kyiv. So welcome both. They are both very important members of ACLED, and I'm thrilled that they're getting to share some of their work with you here today. We also have the pleasure of hosting Christina Villa, who's the founding member and director of Insecurity Insight, an organization dedicated to strengthening the evidence base on violence and its impact on the humanitarian sector, and of course is a valued ACLED partner. Under Christina's leadership, Insecurity Insight has pioneered the use of AI technology to identify reports of conflict-related violence targeting aid operations, healthcare, and education in Ukraine, collaborating with local partners to verify these incidents. Data on attacks on healthcare have been widely cited in reports and policy documents shaping humanitarian policy. Christina also serves as the editor for the annual Safeguarding Health in Conflict Coalition report, which highlights violence against health workers and services in conflict zones. Beyond Insecurity Insight, she holds board positions in the H2H Network and Explosive Weapons Monitor. She has an MPhil in International Relations from the University of Cambridge, UK, and has played a key role in integrating data-driven insights into humanitarian response strategies. We're thrilled to have you here, Christina. It is such a wonderful partnership for ACLED, and of course your skills speak directly to the skills of the authors. After the presentations from Nikita, Ola, and Christina, you will then have the opportunity to ask questions during a live Q&A. Feel free now to pop any questions you have into that Q&A function throughout the event. And with that, I will thank everybody for attending and pass over to Nikita to start us off. Thank you, Nikita.
Thank you, Clionadh. I will first walk you through civilian targeting trends in the 3rd year of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and then discuss some technical aspects of our experimentation with automatic tagging of damage to civilian infrastructure. In terms of direct impact on civilians resulting in bodily injuries, we are seeing an increase in the number of Russia's remote attacks, a shift in weapons used, and some changes in the geography of these attacks compared to the previous year. In a nutshell, we recorded a 30% rise in the number of incidents leading to civilian casualties and a 16% increase of the civilian death toll, with at least 1,600 Ukrainian civilians losing their lives due to strikes. We are also seeing a growing share of aerial attacks against civilians. Their number tripled over the course of 2024. As you can see in this table, the event count is approaching instances of artillery shelling, which have been responsible for most civilian casualties in the previous 2 years. An important note here, about a third of aerial attacks were combined with ground-launched projectiles. This suggests that shelling may remain the chief cause of injury or death among non-combatants. Next slide, please. As you can see in this graph, the quantitative and qualitative change occurred mostly in the second half of 2024. Russian remote attacks against civilians increased steeply in summer and peaked in August and September. Why is this happening? There was a correlation with the intensification of hostilities in the Donetsk region, which is the focus of Russia's ongoing offensive. And there was also a link to the diffusion of the war marked by Russia's reinvasion of the northern Kharkiv region in May and Ukraine's incursion into Russia's Kursk region in August. Next slide, please. Yet, if you look at civilian targeting hotspots, it reveals that the correlation is only partial, because the main reason could be Russia's indiscriminate targeting of entire territory of Ukraine. The Donetsk region has been steadily extremely dangerous for civilians since the start of the invasion, no surprises here. However, as in the previous year, the smaller part of the Kherson region under Ukrainian control bore the brunt of remote attacks again. As you can see in this chart, these are now mostly aerial attacks, increasingly executed with drones. This is despite the area not seeing major combat since Ukraine's withdrawal from their foothold on the Russian-controlled bank of the Dnieper River in spring. Similarly to the Kherson region, we saw an increase in the number of cross-river attacks in the Dnipropetrovsk region, also spared hostilities. It mostly affects the Nikopol district, which is facing the Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. This plant is a source of continuous nuclear safety threat, not only to Ukraine, but also to Europe for 3 years now. Further north, Russian forces subjected Kharkiv to a relentless aerial bombing campaign after a relative respite in 2023. In terms of civilian toll, it has become the deadliest in Ukraine after the Donetsk region, which is the site of most fighting. This happens due to the extensive use of aerial glide bombs, heavy weapons. We also saw that these bombs started raining down on Zaporizhzhia city close to year-end. And finally, Sumy region has become a hotspot after being mostly a backwater after the initial invasion in 2022. And we cannot say that this is the direct consequence of Ukrainian incursion into Kursk region, because we noted increasing civilian targeting there since March. Next slide, please. And now a few remarks on the automatic tagging with my own words. You can see a detailed methodological note on the website. So due to the sheer number of events in Ukraine, we have so far recorded 140,000. Manually adding relevant tags is a daunting task. Filtering events by keywords either may lead to distortions, as calculations are largely blind to context. Therefore, we asked the large language model to crawl nodes to battle and remote violence events for pointers to damage to 4 types of infrastructure that makes one's life possible. These are residential houses, energy infrastructure, health facilities, and educational establishments. Then we went through these events with the highest likelihood of relevance and taught the model to contextualize information to eliminate intruders and gaps, false positives and false negatives. For instance, a mention of ambulance or hospital in nodes does not necessarily mean that an actual strike occurred, because nodes can provide additional information, such as that an ambulance took victims to hospital. Over the course of past 6 months, we tinkered with the model by conducting weekly reviews of tagged events to adjust the attribution of tags. On this slide, I listed a few examples of methodological decisions to improve coverage and accuracy. For instance, we untagged events citing damage to known military infrastructure and asked the machine to include events where damage is inferred, such as power outage. We fed this information to the model each week and retrained it each week. Next slide, please. And now we are integrating all this information into our Ukraine conflict monitor, a dedicated page on ACLED website. As you can see on these visuals, users can visualize trends and geography of attacks on infrastructure on our dashboard. It accompanies our weekly update on the battlefield developments and situations of civilians in Ukraine. Also, tagged events are available for download as a standalone data set. And now Olga will talk about what we saw in it.
Yes, thank you, Nikita. Now, if we move to the next slide, we can start looking at what we found with these tagged events. As Clionadh mentioned, we tagged almost 5,500 events from February 2022 to the end of 2024. 75% of these events include damage to residential buildings. As you can see from the table on the slide, the number of events of Russian infrastructure targeting increased for almost all infrastructure types in 2024 compared to 2023. I also want to point out a few difficulties and maybe caveats with collecting data and interpreting this data. One difficulty that we face is that when the extent of damage is particularly high, it may not be captured very well in the reports that we're using to collect data. And here I'm particularly talking about the frontline towns that turn into battlegrounds and often end up just being leveled by Russian forces. For the purposes of this analysis, we generally excluded all the battle events. So we only look at various missile drone strikes of Russia, shelling, and other types of events like this. Another constraint is that sometimes information on infrastructure damage is not full. So the reports that we're using may talk about damage to civilian infrastructure, but not specify one of the 4 types of infrastructure that we're tracking. We have now over 4,000 events like this that mention in the notes civilian infrastructure, but are not tagged because none of the specific infrastructure types are mentioned. A final thing to take into account is that the tags do not show severity. So one tagged event may talk about damage to one building. Another tagged event may talk about the destruction of dozens of buildings. And this is because of our methodology and the way we aggregate and disaggregate events. But this information can always be found in the notes to each event. Now on the next slide, we can look at damage to events that involve damage to residential infrastructure that we captured. As you can see, this type of infrastructure damage affects the whole country. Since the start of the full-scale invasion, it has been recorded pretty much everywhere, even though we only include Russian projectiles, Russian attacks here. In 2024 alone, we recorded damage in 24 regions out of 27, in comparison, for example, to 17 regions in 2022. These attacks appear largely indiscriminate, but we can also see a pattern of what seems to be disregard of Russian forces towards sparing civilian infrastructure. Some buildings that are hit are clearly located far from any potential military objectives, and some attacks seem to just be meant to hit populated areas. But other attacks may happen as collateral to other targets, Some events included here also involved falling debris of intercepted drones or missiles, and also occasional events happen by mistake, especially in the occupied areas occupied by Russia. But regardless of the circumstances, the consequences that entire country is not completely safe from having civilians face damage or destruction of their homes. Now, on the next slide, we can look at damage to infrastructure, to education infrastructure. Similarly to residential, it mostly appears indiscriminate. A lot of events that include damage to education infrastructure also include damage to other types of infrastructure during the same attack. But the education system in Ukraine is affected in more ways than just attacks that lead to damage or destruction of education facilities. Further from the front line, there is always a risk of an attack. So whenever there is an air raid alert, schooling is interrupted, with children having to go to bomb shelters. In frontline areas and areas that border Russia, the situation is more dangerous. Attacks are generally more frequent. So here, some schools only operate remotely, so not in person. Other schools have opened underground where it is safer. Even in occupied areas, there are some risks, particularly for people who seek Ukrainian school education for their children, which may be risky in those areas. Next, on the next slide, we can see what we found with regard to targeting of energy infrastructure. Similar to the previous types of infrastructure, damage to energy infrastructure is sometimes collateral, but we can also see a very clear, deliberate campaign by Russian forces to aimed at destroying energy infrastructure across Ukraine. This campaign started back in October 2022, right at the start of the heating season. In 2024, it was a little different. It started right after the heating season and affected the population in peak consumption months in summer. The campaign also renewed during the heating season with a spike in December that also affected heating supply in some regions. The 2024 campaign was also different in that it focused more so on the destruction of power generation facilities and not only targeting of power distribution facilities, with a lot of thermal power plants targeted and many of them destroyed across the country, which by September reduced the thermal power output by 80%. Nuclear power plants are also not spared, even though they're particularly dangerous. In 2024, in second half of 2024, we saw several attacks where power grids, which connect to nuclear power plants, were targeted, which threatens emergency reduction of output at those power plants. And of course, there is a very difficult situation with the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, which lies directly on the front line and becomes target of semi-frequent attacks. And any attempts to remove Russian forces from that area and create a demilitarized zone have failed so far. Next slide, please. The targeting of energy infrastructure affects the everyday life of civilians in various ways. The overall reduced power generation capacity led to rolling blackouts across the country, even back in 2022. Besides that, during attacks or following attacks, there is also a risk of emergency blackouts, which can last for quite a long time. In bigger cities, blackouts can also lead to water supply and heating supply disruptions. Also, bigger cities obviously have a lot of high-rise buildings in Ukraine. And so whenever there is a blackout and elevators are disabled, it may be difficult or even impossible for some number of people to get to their apartments when there is a blackout. Finally, these blackouts also overload cellular networks, making mobile service or cellular internet less reliable. Next slide, please. To sum up, we can see a clear pattern of Russian attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, both indiscriminate and targeted. Even when it comes to indiscriminate attacks, the frequency of attacks and the extent of damage that we see points to at least a lack of care on the side of Russian forces in sparing civilian objects. These attacks affect the whole country in various ways, some more severe, some less so, but the fact is that everywhere in Ukraine, civilians see the impact of the ongoing war. Finally, despite Russia being responsible for the vast majority of the attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, the fact that civilians in Ukraine are suffering ends up sometimes being used against Ukraine to compel Ukraine to something. And I think in this environment, it is particularly important for organizations like ours to collect unbiased, comprehensive data. And also the excellent work of other organizations is very important, such as Insecurity Insight, whose director, Christina, will now walk us through the targeting of healthcare infrastructure in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Ola, and thank you very much for ACLED for this invitation to speak here today. So I've prepared comments on sort of two aspects. The first one is about the specific details we have in the data on attacks on healthcare. And then I'm finishing off with some observations of what this violence actually does to the health sector. Next slide. So we have a map on Ukraine for which you find the address in the bottom, and you can, of this particular slide, attacks on health Ukraine, and you're welcome to sort of explore that. And this is where I'm referring to when I speak about the data here. So as was already said in the introduction, we are much more specialized on topics that affect the humanitarian work. And so our focus on attacks on healthcare covers a wide range, any sort of events that interfere with the delivery of healthcare. And for that, we have over 2,700 events. Of these, 900 affected hospitals and clinics in some form. And if you move to the next slide, we have an overview of how well, you sort of see the specific incidents of violence against healthcare plotted on a map, but also on a timeline. And regarding the timeline, I think there's sort of two things to note. The first is the horrendous spike at the beginning of the conflict. 250 recorded incidents during the month of March in 2022. And this is a phenomenon we're seeing in a number of conflicts where healthcare is targeted, that at the beginning of the conflict there is extreme violence, and then it continues throughout the conflict without a month where health infrastructure is not affected. And yeah, on the map you can also sort of see that, obviously, not surprisingly, it really focuses on the sort of eastern ring, but also it is occurring throughout the whole country, and that refers to some of the remote violence. And if you move to the next slide, I've broken it up by the 3 years since the full-scale invasion, and you can see which year this is referring to by which part of the data that always stays the same is yellow. So on the top left, you have the 22 data, to the top right, you have the 23 data, and at the bottom, the 24, always you see where the data is yellow. And if we then look at how the events are plotted on the maps over those 3 years, I think there's sort of 2 key observations to take from this. One is that overall, the number of such incidents has slightly fallen over the years. That 22 has been particularly intensive. They have been much more sort of concentrated in the last 2 years. And as we can also see in 23, there are a number of incidents all the way to the eastern border of Ukraine, whereas in 24, they occurred much more along the front line of actual fighting, but they also occurred much more in the northeast. But these refers really to all incidents of violence against healthcare, including occupations of health facilities and several other instances. And if you move to the next slide, I've here prepared a bit of an overview of how these sort of overall attacks on healthcare break down just by looking at 2 categories. So on the right, again in yellow, this is the data that is selected from the total. This is the number of times the infrastructure was damaged. And this is any health infrastructure, hospital, clinics, warehouses to keep medication, to garages for ambulances itself. And to the left, you see again in yellow, the incidents in which health workers were killed. And I've sort of selected these 2 to sort of point at some of the complexities in terms of the data around violence against healthcare. Because as we can see there were some 900 attacks in which the hospitals were damaged and 58 health workers were killed. And if we look across, there are 64 attacks in which health workers were killed while they were in hospital. So I've just put these 2 examples to just show how sort of complex the data around violence against healthcare can be, because individual incidents can have multiple effects in terms of the health workforce, the health infrastructure, or everything around the services that's needed, including also the energy to run it, as has already been pointed out. And if you move to the next slide, I now want to sort of mention a few things in terms of what this violence against civilians, and in this specific case, the health sector, actually means for the infrastructure, the workforce, and the patients. You can move to the next slide. The destruction to the actual infrastructure, I don't think we need to say very much. In such buildings, it is impossible to deliver healthcare, and we've already seen the images of the impact on the energy. Hospitals need electricity, they need water, they need increasingly connectivity to function. So clearly that sort of violence makes it impossible to run healthcare in the way the healthcare system used to operate. And if you move to the next slide, this has an impact on particular population groups, specifically small children who need vaccinations and particular care. It is pregnant women who access the health service. It is the elderly. It is people with disabilities, people who've had incidents, and the chronically ill, whether physically or mentally. So these populations suffer enormously, but that also means if we want to look or quantify the impact on this, it is not something data we can collect from the population as such. We really need to look at the groups who most need the health service, because depending on where they are in their life cycle and their access to healthcare they need. Next slide. And another key thing is that the violence against the health system demands enormous changes to the way the health system is functioning. So one thing that we've seen in Ukraine in particular is there's much fewer childhood injuries, and that is because children are just fewer in the country, but they're also not let out to play. There's no children's birthday parties where they can knock out their teeth on a trampoline. So all of these sort of childhood incidents, they stop occurring to the same level as they did before. At the same time, you have an enormous increase in medical needs from mainly young adults, having terrible injuries from weapon systems, bullet wounds and shrapnel. And that requires that the health system relearns its skills. And you can move to the next slide. So what we've seen, for example, in Ukraine happening, there's pediatric surgeons, people who would fix children's broken limbs, trained to become war surgeons. And a lot of this was delivered remotely. The health workforce also had to learn to work in completely different health structures, besides some sort of field hospital, which means it is very different the way you run your daily activities. And that requires an awful lot of relearning of the health workforce to sort of respond to these attacks. You can move to the next slide. And then there's the question of how do you keep the services running that are just needed? And here's just the example of maternity care, because while births do tend to go down 9 months after the start of the conflict, they occur at very high levels or at anticipated levels before. And women need these sort of support, and it was moved to basements. The health system was extremely resilient, but the added stress on women needing maternity care and the health system to function under such circumstances can really not be underestimated. And you can move to the next slide. And this is exactly the sort of scenes that everyone wants to avoid, because this is no way of providing healthcare. And I'm sure you all remember these images from Mariupol of a pregnant woman being taken out of a bombed hospital. You can move to the next slide. Another very often underappreciated factor is what it does to the health workforce to work under such circumstances. Because of the blackouts, because of the difficulties in daily life, many have to choose between staying with patients, staying in the hospitals, or going back to their families, which means there is it's an enormously difficult working situation. And it also has an impact on gender distribution, for example, in who can choose to stay with the patients, who has to be with the families. So the demands on the health system are enormous under such violence, as we've sort of seen in this webinar so far. You can move to the next slide. And one key thing is really the enormous resilience of the health system in Ukraine. And you can move to the next slide. One example was that solar panels have been put on hospitals to make them more independent from this cut in the energy system. And you can move to the sort of the next slide. Oops, yeah, so this is the one. And it is really just something that talks sort of conceptually about what the resilience to the system does in terms of how every incident makes it, all of these incidents that we've seen in this webinar makes just the working so much harder. And the more you sort of accumulate these incidents within a system, from the energy, the civilian housing destruction, the education destruction, the health system destructions, the harder it gets. But if you put in these mitigation measures, you can take some of this strain off. And this is something that we've seen that was exceptional in Ukraine, the extent to which the health system has adapted to these terrible challenges. But at the same time, we really should not underestimate what it meant for the health workforce to work in such circumstances and for patients to accessing their care they need. So with that, I sort of really want to finish, and you can move to the final slide that just mentions some of the resources and the sort of project we are working with. You can move to the next slide. Yeah, this one. So the final point I really wanted to close on is we are collecting this information, and I think it's so important it is documented, and we are aware of the extent of this damage and destruction. And we need to think of what it actually does to the systems and how they are working, and what can be done to support systems to continue functioning under such an onslaught of violence that really threatens the most vulnerable in these situations the most, but really undermine the whole society in its functioning. So thank you very much, ACLED, for putting this important webinar together, and yeah, looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Christina, and of course to Nikita and Olha for their wonderful presentations. I think that we've all learned about the harrowing costs that Ukrainian civilians have had to assume, given the 3 years of conflict, especially within the contained area in the east. There's a few questions that I think I'll put to the authors, and of course Christina too, if you're willing to answer. But please don't hesitate to put additional questions in the Q&A. I'm going to start with Clotilde's question. From a military and strategic standpoint, has targeting civilian infrastructure achieved the intended objectives for Russia, or has it backfired in terms of the Ukrainian resistance and international response? Nikita, I'm going to send that one to you for the moment, please.
Yeah, thank you. Well, to speak of strategic objectives, you need to see the campaign end, and it has not. The energy infrastructure is targeted every week. I'm not in a position to discuss Ukrainian resistance because I'm not in Ukraine, and I'm not a Ukrainian. In terms of international response, I think the mobilization of the international donors for the initial wave of attacks was remarkable. The attacks in October 2022 to March 2023, but fixing the damage was easier back then because the strikes targeted mostly power distribution network, which is substations, power lines, the auxiliary infrastructure. These days, especially last year, the goal was clearly to take out power plants themselves, which may be difficult for anyone to replace quickly.
Thank you very much. I'm also, just as a side note, I'm very sorry about the balloons. I don't know why it happens. It happens every time I'm on any meeting, but it's constant. So apologies. Well, actually, just to carry on that question, and perhaps Olha, you would also have some input on this, and of course, Christina, please join in. I recall last year's presentation that we did on the second year, documenting a decrease in civilian targeting that we encountered. So what do you think has led to the significant change that you both noted occurred in the summer of last year?
I think Russia is trying different things. We've noted different changes in strategy. Overall, Russian actions stay quite similar throughout the whole 3 years, but we see slight shifts, either weapons change. I think that's a big contributor in 2024. The change, the increased use of glide bombs, which are much more deadly than, for example, drones, that contributed to the higher civilian death count. Yeah, overall, it is hard to say that it changes the dynamic that much of what is happening in Ukraine. Similar things continue to happen, just Russia got more glide bombs, or Russia got more this, or Ukraine tries something, and whenever Ukraine is successful in a strike or in the Kursk region invasion, then retaliation comes. Yeah, that's all I can say on this.
That's really helpful. So less of a strategy and more of a retaliation or a surplus of new military hardware that they have to use. So their decline was not intentional, and their increase is as much as they are capable of doing at the moment.
I would say so. We see more the consequences of what happens, but these consequences are not necessarily the plan.
That's really helpful. Thank you. There were some questions here about what impact the war has had specifically on mental health. Christina, did you want to take that one, please?
Yeah, and I can also sort of very briefly perhaps also say something to the previous question. I think I would very much agree with what Ola said in terms of the difference in weapon systems available. What we've seen with the health facilities in particular is that during the very first month, there were a lot of attacks with very old missiles from the 1960s that were originally developed to hit American aircraft carriers. So they went just for the biggest building in town, and that would sometimes be the hospital. So that we've not seen a lot since then. But then there's the glide bombs, and they, I think, tend to go much more for civilian areas. And we've seen a certain decline in the number of recorded attacks on healthcare. And I think that may partly also be because the mitigation measures in place managed to protect that a bit better. So I think the key thing I would say is what we observe in terms of impact is always a combination of the potency of the attacker, what weapon systems they have, the vulnerability of the population, and to what extent they can or cannot protect themselves, and the intention. And it always is a combination of these three factors together that explain what we see. But yeah, the mental health impact, I think, has been enormous. I think it's very, very difficult to quantify that. Certainly with the health staff, we see it just how exhausted they are and how difficult it also is to sort of really change how they work. I can't imagine what the situation is like for the civilian population not being able to sleep properly. And so, yeah, I think the mental health impact is very, very high. And I think the only positive we can say here is just how much more people talk about these things and take them into account than in the past. But I think the suffering is very real.
Thank you very much. Actually, Raphael had a follow-on to that question, which is these double tap attacks, and we have an idea of the impact, both physical and psychological, of such attacks, and to what extent such data can be used to develop or strengthen a legal framework around these attacks, both to healthcare facilities more broadly, but also to repeated attacks on individuals, repeated exposure. Christina, do you want to try that? And of course,
I can try that. I mean, I think one of the really difficult questions around the legal system is also under what legal framework are we looking? Are we looking under IHL? And then it's always a question of to what extent it's proportional and indiscriminate and these aspects. And maybe under this, the issue of double tap strikes would make a very powerful argument. But then there is the question, where would such IHL legal arguments be taken to? I think that's then the big question. So yeah, I'm no lawyer, but I think we would probably have to work out the precise legal framework and the argument we need to put forward first to understand what evidence we can really use in order to make that case. But there may be, I mean, Ola may be a much better person to answer any sort of legal consideration.
Yeah, please do, Ola. And of course, given what's been happening in the last few weeks, I think very clever legal arguments might not necessarily land on the right ears, but what kind of progress has there been around legal arguments like this?
Exactly, that's something I wanted to say, is that something being legal or not legal does not seem to affect the way Russia chooses to act. We can see that as well with the International Criminal Court arrest warrants, both for the abduction of children and for the targeting of energy infrastructure. You can see that energy infrastructure targeting has not decreased since then, and the Russian leadership does not seem to be fazed by the fact that this is a clear violation of law. So I think there is a lot of wonderful work going on documenting the war crimes and crimes against humanity and making these legal arguments. I think it is very important because we have to be able to distinguish right from wrong and be able to put a label on something and understand it in clear terms. But in terms of what practically happens afterwards and how Russia acts afterwards, it does not really change, unfortunately, yet.
Thank you very much, Christina. That's very helpful. There are a few questions in here about data on utility workers, or for example, like public services and utilities, and then specifically one on the later attack on the Chernobyl power plant, which may have caused devastating consequences not only for Ukraine, but a big part of Europe and Russia. It's not been mentioned, but worth noting. And is there any clarity on who is responsible for that attack at this point?
Yeah, I'll take this just to mention about utility workers or any other data that people are interested in. I would welcome people to look at the data itself, download the data and look at it. We're not tracking, we don't have a separate tag for tracking attacks on utility workers, but you can try various keywords and play with the keywords in the notes to be able to find those types of attacks that you're interested in. We have seen events like this, and yeah, you can find them in the data set. With regard to the Chernobyl strike, we have it in the data as well. I think we mentioned it in our most recent Ukraine update that you can see on Ukraine Conflict Monitor, that we regularly write updates of the situation in Ukraine. We focused this report and the presentation mostly on 2024, comparing 2024 to the previous years. We recorded this strike as the Russian drone strike from all of the information that we have seen so far. So yes, that's what I will say on this.
Thank you very much. And in fact, it clarifies some things that have been being chatted about in the Q&A, which is that the data are collected every week and released every week. So that continues. This report was written with data up till the end of 2024 in order to give it a comparison to what we had previously done on it. Of course, both Olha and Nikita are very heavily involved in our Ukraine conflict monitor, where you can get all of the materials that we previously mentioned that Nikita went through, and of course Ola went through also. And the details about where those data come from and the methodology behind both the report and the data, and I'm sure Insecurity Insight has also several resources on this, are very openly available in several places on the ACLED site, and I'll let Christina note about where the information from Insecurity Insight is also available.
Thank you. So there is the attacks on healthcare in Ukraine map, and I don't know, Gina, whether you could perhaps also put them in the chat. And there's various links on that site to the reports and also the data on HDX, where the sort of the incident data around that is available. And if you have further questions, don't hesitate to get in touch.
Thank you very much. And these data, both Insecurity Insight and ACLED data, of course, are available at the locality. So we aggregated them up at this point in order to demonstrate the maps, but they are by location, and the characteristics of those events are available within that raw data. So that deals with a few questions from the Q&A that I thought might be useful, but I actually want to come back to a line in the report and get your perspective, I suppose, on what this means going forward. And the line was, estimated to cost hundreds of billions of US dollars and growing, continued reconstruction efforts and eventual complete recovery will have to see Ukraine's partners overcome fatigue and aid skepticism amid ravaging Russian offensives, indiscriminate strikes on populated areas, and deliberate destructive campaigns. So Christina went over this a little bit about local recovery efforts and local resilience, but what are we seeing in these regions that have been absolutely pummeled over the last 3 years, about what prospects there are for recovery and what's possible? This is to everybody, I think.
Okay, I can start a little bit. A lot of areas that are completely pummeled are under Russian control because they get like this during the Russian offensive. So that will depend on who will be in control of those areas and what efforts they will take to recover those areas. But we have seen pretty devastating strikes as well in the Russian-controlled areas. Of course, the increased use of glide bombs is not helping there as well. We see sometimes pretty quick reconstruction. I think mostly in those attacks that get sort of a lot of media attention and get very very popular across Ukraine, and then you can see the comparison images of pretty quick recovery, but it is a recovery that is not very sort of stable, right? Those areas still continue to be in danger of further attacks. So I think there is definitely some concern on the side of people who are deciding to what extent to recover areas, concerned to not spend too much if it's going to be destroyed quite soon afterwards. But the ongoing recovery efforts mostly concern those services that are very important, critical services, access, water supply, electricity supply, all of these things. But yeah, for complete recovery, it is hard to talk about it during the armed conflict. But I definitely imagine that Ukraine would need a lot of support from its partners in order to make it effective and in order to bring it to a very nice and livable condition and make those cities as beautiful as they were before the armed conflict.
Thanks, Olha. I appreciate that. Christina and Nikita?
Maybe to add to that, sort of in a similar line as Ola said, that I think during the areas under heavy bombardment at the moment, the focus is probably not on reconstruction, but on mitigation, to ensuring that systems function by moving them underground, as schools have been moved underground, as hospitals are underground, as services are taken apart, that they're not that easily identifiable as such, rather than to really rebuilding. And I think the rebuilding would probably only be financed by external actors after some kind of a peace agreement that would be trusted, so that yeah, while things are ongoing, the efforts are in this coping and continuing to cope. And I think in this respect, it's particularly concerning that some of the financing for salaries of, in particular, health workers are currently in jeopardy. And I think that's the kind of things that are really essential, because it's the people who keep things going at this stage.
Thanks, Christina. Excellent points. Nikita?
I think I'll always cover it. I can only add that the discussion of fatigue of donors is not comparable to the level of fatigue within Ukraine itself and its population. This is something that we should keep in mind.
That's an excellent point. In a previous webinar, in fact, right before we ended for the year, we noted in our conflict index that conflict rates had doubled in the past 5 years. And with that, of course, with certainly, if not a collapse, then a severe change in the aid infrastructure within the global arena, where we're looking at a very difficult set of conversations, of course, going forward with both Gaza and Ukraine, Sudan, and some other major conflicts. However, I don't think, as you all mentioned, it's time to discuss recovery yet, when people are still attempting to mitigate and live with the effect of violence. It's really well noted within this report. I encourage everybody to use it, and of course to share it if you wish. That report is available now. I want to thank everybody for their time and attention today, and especially the authors, and of course Christina for offering her wonderful insights, and the Partnership of Insecurity Insight more generally to ACLED. I will end it here. Well, thank you very much, everybody. And there's a harrowing anniversary on Monday, but I hope that there's no more bad news for Ukraine in the interim. Thank you very much.